The self-proclaimed freedom lover Javier Milei defeated the Argentine political establishment on the 19th of November with an anarcho-capitalist punch in the face and is now set to take office as the country's president on December 10th. The otherwise perilous country elected him after decades of economic crises, most recently a gigantic inflationary crisis with triple-digit inflation and a free-falling currency. He campaigned with bold politics such as closing the Argentine central bank, introducing the US dollar as Argentina's currency, closing more than 10 ministries, stopping trade with socialist countries like China, denying climate change and similar controversial statements. It happened with an even bolder campaign where he dressed up as his alter ego, an anarcho-capitalist superhero, and with chainsaws and baseball bats showed what he wanted to do with the country's public sector and the central bank. Such a campaign has naturally drawn massive media attention worldwide. His campaign has, for instance, been embraced by the top figures on the American right, including Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson, as well as a handful of European populist parties. Admittedly, it's not my political crowd, but since his bombastic political campaign has now found its way to the US and Europe, perhaps you should ask, is Javier Milei just a madman from a country gone mad, or is there something we can learn from him here in the wealthier countries of the global north?
Mr. Milei, known as El Loco, or the Madman, pulled off a major upset.
Part 1. Central Bank Closure. Milei believes the Argentine central bank is responsible for the country's long history of sky-high inflation. He argues that its monetary policies, such as manipulating interest rates and printing money to finance government spending, have caused a devaluation of the Argentine peso. There is probably nothing wrong with that analysis, but what about our own central banks in the global north, especially the two most influential ones, the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve? How have they managed their political mandate? Have they complied with it? Have they been as independent as they tried to give the impression of being? I would argue, no, not at all. It is, among other things, difficult to explain the financial crisis of 2008 without mentioning Alan Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006. From day one in office, he led an outspoken campaign to deregulate the financial sector. Sometimes that happened in collaboration with elected representatives in Congress, and the deregulations were implemented in a democratic and relatively transparent manner. But sometimes these deregulations were implemented without Congress voting for them. That, for instance, happened when the Fed, under his leadership, decided to reinterpret the Glass-Steagall legislation in 1996. Here, Fed increased how much revenue commercial banking companies were allowed to earn from speculative investment banking from 10 to 25%. I don't want to get too much into a discussion as to whether these deregulations were sensible or not, but they were, in any case, introduced under some rather peculiar circumstances. During Greenspan's tenure, there were quite many and fairly large financial crises. For instance, Black Monday in 1987, the largest one-day decline in history on the global stock markets. There was also the Southeast Asian financial crisis, which, despite the name, was a global financial crisis and very much related to US central bank policies. And notably, the dot-com bubble that burst in 2000, which, with the help of Greenspan's monetary policies, ended up becoming a new bubble, a housing bubble, which he passed on to his successor.
What do? The Fed lowers interest rates, basically allows Wall Street to recapitalize, drink itself sober, and they plunge into the next madness, which is mortgages. And once again, you have Alan Greenspan saying, hey, real estate is a great bet.
When the financial sector gets into trouble when you start to deregulate it, most people would probably argue it would be a good idea to slow down the pace of these deregulations. But instead, Greenspan accelerated them. The idea behind deregulation is also that the sector must self-regulate. In an ideal market, the market rewards responsible financial institutions for being safe places to put one's money, while irresponsibility, like outright financial gambling, should at least in the long run be punished by the market. Under Greenspan, these market forces were partially put out of play by the Federal Reserve as they increasingly intervened in financial markets to avoid financial crises. This was done by giving insurance on losses in risky financial assets, so financial institutions got encouraged to invest in them. They also experimented with ultra-low interest rates so financial institutions could invest/speculate their way out of crises with borrowed money. And Greenspan orchestrated various bailouts of failed investments between financial institutions.
Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan didn't want to see any regulation of banks, of markets. And on the other hand, he's pulling switches and moving levers and, more than any Fed chairman before or since.
This increased the amount of risky bets in the financial sector quite significantly, so the housing bubble crashed in 07-08. There were so many risky bets related to the housing market that the financial sector was on its way to a total collapse.
It was dire. We were a few days away from the ATMs not working.
Since then, the central bank policies of rich countries have generally become even more aggressive. To get their economies back on track after the 08 crisis, most rich countries have artificially stimulated the financial sector with so-called quantitative easing programs. Here, central banks print new money to buy financial assets on the financial markets, especially mortgage and government debt. They have done so to ensure injections of new money into the financial sector, enable ultra-low interest rates for government debt, and prevent prices from falling in the housing market. These QE policies have unfortunately also led to a historic explosion in inequality, that house prices have gotten even more expensive in the middle of an affordable housing crisis, created risky financial bubbles. For instance, when the government debt bubble crashed in 22-23, it led to the collapse of Credit Suisse and Silicon Valley Bank, among others. Suggesting to close the European Central Bank or the Fed would probably be too bold a move. However, a debate on the central bank's political mandate would be a welcome discussion. That we have ended up in a political situation where Wall Street gambling is considered such a high monetary priority that it trumps affordable housing and other real economic issues is rather grotesque and absurd, to put it mildly. Part 2. Money printing.
A ver, yo creo que hay una discusión previa sobre la dolarización. En realidad, en rigor, es la eliminación del Banco Central.
Milei would like to adopt the dollar as Argentina's currency to stabilize the amount of money in circulation in the country. Whether it's a good idea is hard to say. Whether it's even possible is also highly questionable. But how much money that circulates in an economy is an extremely essential question, even in prosperous economies. However, there is a significant difference in how the amount of money increases in Argentina compared to most rich economies. In rich countries, the amount of money in circulation is to a larger extent controlled by private banks and not so much by the central bank. And the politicians in these rich countries would do all of us a favor to familiarize themselves with how it works. When the NGO Positive Money asked the British Parliament members whether it's true that private banks create new money when they give out loans, only 15% knew the correct answer, even though most British elected officials have long academic degrees, and it's written on the Bank of England's website, where you, for instance, can read. Most of the money in the economy is created not by printing presses at the central bank, but by banks when they provide loans. If you borrow £100 from the bank and it credits your account with the amount, new money has been created. It didn't exist until it was credited to your account. Banks create around 80% of money in the economy as electronic deposits in this way. One might be tempted to dismiss that as technicalities, but a money supply that is out of control creates inflation regardless of whether it's the private banking sector or a central bank that creates the money. We can observe the effect of this newly created money has on house prices if we put the amount of mortgage debt and house prices into the same graph. Here it's exemplified for the US, but it will look similar for almost all richer economies.
You're creating new money, but you're not creating new goods and services. You're simply,
they're constant, aren't they?
You're giving somebody new purchasing power over existing assets, and therefore you must push up asset prices. So this, you can draw a chart where you show, asset prices, land prices, property prices in the UK, and they will match very closely as I've shown in Japan and other countries.
In other words, money creation is also relevant for global north economies. However, it's relevant in a different way than in Argentina. Most rich countries have an affordable housing crisis that is out of control. The housing market is inflated by money created by private banks, and the politicians of these countries apparently don't even know where 80% of the money in the economy comes from. How absurd is that? Part 3. Responsible Government Spending.
Ministerio de Cultura, afuera. Ministerio de Ambiente y Desarrollo Sostenible, afuera. Ministerio de las Mujeres y Género y Diversidad, afuera.
Argentina has become the textbook example of how not to manage an economy responsibly. But what about the economies of the global north? Are they financed responsibly? The national debt of several of the world's largest economies is more than 100% of GDP. This applies, for example, to the United States, Canada, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom, all among the world's 10 largest economies. For the US, there's already more debt than the country had during the Second World War, and the debt is projected to grow to over 200% during the 2050s by the Congressional Budget Office. 19% of the federal budget is already being spent on servicing debt, so it's not cheap to owe so much money, and many of those who will end up paying for the debt don't have the right to vote yet, or are in a situation that will not benefit much from whatever public services the debt finances. Moreover, the US finances most of its public debt via international financial markets, where it's sold as government bonds called treasuries, which financial institutions such as banks, mutual funds, and pension funds then buy. How can there be enough money in circulation for financial institutions to buy so much debt? We covered that in the last part. It's because private banks create more and more money, for instance as loans in the housing market. More and more money created as loans in the housing market, as previously mentioned, creates higher and higher house prices. Thus, governments have become indirectly dependent on rising house prices to finance their debt. This means governments have an interest in making it as easy as possible for private banks to create money, even though it leads to inflation in the housing market. We can see that if we put house prices and government debt for the US into the same graph, it's not one-to-one, please note the index numbers in the graph. However, there is a clear tendency: when house prices rise, so does government debt. So on top of the fact that it costs money in the form of interest rates to finance debt, it also costs money in the form of inflation, especially in the housing market.
All their plans are to spend even more money when they're supposedly complaining about inflation. Inflation is the tax that we're paying to finance all their spending.
Most economies have more control over the national debt than the United States. The problem, however, is that the US is the leading financial power in the world, and if this is how they want the debt to be financed, then it affects all housing markets connected to the same financial markets as the US. It's obviously an irresponsible way to finance government spending, both because it seems that the government debt is out of control, but perhaps it's an even bigger problem if we look at it with democratic ideals. Inflation in the housing market is a highly opaque way to tax the population. Again, Milei's topic is relevant in the global north, but in a different way and through some other institutions.
Part 4. Wealth creation.
El Estado no crea riqueza, el Estado la destruye. El Estado no puede dar nada porque no produce nada, y cuando lo quiere hacer además lo hace mal.
Milei doesn't think the public sector creates wealth. Here's the point of those I've chosen to comment on, where Milei is most irrelevant to the economies of the global north. He might have a good point about Argentina, where 80% of Argentina's population depends on some form of public good, whether it's subsidies, handouts, or employment in the government. But in the global north, the public sector creates plenty of wealth. You can just look up the technologies inside your smartphone, such as Wi-Fi, internet, GPS, touchscreen, various coding languages, lithium-ion batteries, etc., etc.
Everything that makes your smartphone smart and not stupid was actually publicly financed. The internet, GPS, touchscreen display, and even Siri, the voice-activated system.
Personally, I doubt that a state-owned company could put these technologies together and create such a user-friendly, functional, and relatively affordable product as an iPhone. For that kind of innovation, where already existing technologies are put together as a consumer product, the private sector plays a fundamental role. However, when researching technologies that are perhaps 5, 10, 20 years away from being a possible consumer product you can buy in stores, the incentives for private sector investors are pretty hypothetical. If you want to focus on a sector that's particularly bad at creating wealth, looking at the private financial sector is probably more relevant.
My book explores how the rise of our financial sector over the last 40 years, the growth in size, which has been tremendous, and also the change in what the capital markets actually do in their own business model, is hurting companies and is hurting our economic growth.
The financial sector doesn't only appear to be extremely bad at creating real tangible wealth, it can also be argued that it pollutes our economies with extreme financial risk, that sometimes develops into financial crises, that it pollutes our economies with money creation that results in inflation, and make the argument that it pollutes our democratic institutions with its lobbyists that make our political institutions more corrupt, which are quite frankly wealth-destroying activities.
Part 5. Conclusion.
So is Javier Milei a madman from a country gone mad? I would generally go with that, and I haven't even highlighted some of his disgusting ethical policies. However, the themes of his policies, such as central bank policies, money creation, responsible government spending, and wealth creation, are important policy areas that have been neglected in the mainstream political debate for many years. And I would love to see them back on the table